The word macro means big, and the word micro means small. So when we're talking about macroeconomics, we're looking at economics at a very high level. And microeconomics, we're looking at a very small level. For example, microeconomics would be looking at the economics of an individual person or an individual firm or company. How did they behave? And what are the economics there? Whereas macroeconomics looks at the entire country. So we often call it like the aggregate of everybody in the economy. So not just one person, but all people. Not just one company, but all companies. And that's what we're going to be looking at in this course. This first chapter about macroeconomics is really just an introduction to it, talking about all of the elements or all of the concepts that we're going to be exploring over the course of this class, really. Okay, so really today is just a lot of definitions, get to know what certain things mean, and then we'll explore that in a more in-depth way as we work through this course. So let's start with this first part, key macroeconomic variables. This is what we're going to be exploring as we work through the chapters. One of the main things, probably the main thing in this course, is the concept of national product or national income. So there are many different ways to measure national income, the main one being the GDP. Okay, so you have the definition here, which says the national product is the value of the income generated by the production of total output. And that's really what GDP is. GDP, the gross domestic product, is the value of all the goods and services produced within a country. It really gives you a sense of how much money the country is. So try and imagine that a country is a company, right? And companies measure revenue being the sales that they generate. Well, for a country, the revenue would be that GDP. Now, there are other measures that we don't really get into in this course, like, for example, the gross national product, which is similar to the GDP. The main difference being that GDP looks at goods and services that are produced within the actual country. That's it. Whereas gross national product is, again, the total market value of goods and services produced by a resident of the country, no matter where they're living. So just to explain that, you can have a Canadian company that manufactures in China. Well, whatever is manufactured in China would not be part of the GDP, but it would be part of the GNP, right? GDP has to actually be produced within Canada. GNP, the gross national product, can be produced anywhere in the world as long as it's produced by a Canadian or a Canadian company. Then you have national income, which we will talk a little bit about. Again, this is basically the total amount of income that's earned within a country. This could be wages if we're talking about workers. It could be profits if we're talking about businesses. Basically, all the money that was earned by people. And we'll see later on when we're calculating GDP that you can actually find GDP many different ways. One is the production method, where we look at all the goods that were produced. One is the income method, where we look at all the income that was earned. We'll get to that. Now, something you'll see come up a lot is the concept of real national income or real GDP. And that's what we really do spend most of this course focusing on. But it's important now that we're just talking about the beginning to understand the difference. So we have nominal national income. So this could be nominal GDP, for example, which is basically measured in today's dollars. What is the total amount of dollars generated by a country in this particular year? Then you have real national income, which uses a base year. Just to explain why that's even a thing. The problem with nominal income or nominal GDP is that it doesn't really factor in inflation. So you might have, let's say in 2023, you might be given a GDP of 1 billion, and then in 2024, let's say the GDP is 1.2 billion. And you might look at this and say, well, great, our GDP is growing, our economy is growing. But it might not be. This might just be caused by inflation. If you're producing, and I'll try and keep this super simple, 100 units, which you were selling for $10, this would be $1,000. Okay, so let's call this the GDP for 2023. Okay, let's get rid of this 1 billion. Let's say our GDP in 2023 is $1,000. Let's say in the following year, we actually produce fewer units, 80 units. But because of inflation, let's say this went up to $20. Well, now your nominal GDP is 1,600. It went up. But we're actually doing worse. Our country is producing fewer goods than it was before. So we've actually shrunk from a production standpoint. And that's the problem with the nominal GDP. It looks at what the current prices are. Whereas the real GDP uses a constant dollar value. So it assigns basically the same price to every year. It keeps price constant so that we can actually compare just production. So let's say here we used 2023 as the base year. Well, in 2024, I would still use $10. And this would be my real GDP. So it'd be $800 in 2024. And I can say, oh, you know what? GDP is actually, in real terms, decreasing. So all of that to say, guys, real national income or real GDP measures quantity, whereas nominal GDP just measures dollars, and dollars are kind of meaningless when you're going over multiple years. So for the rest of this course, we're going to be looking at real GDP. And almost always when we say GDP, you should assume we're talking about real GDP. We're really interested in our production. Another thing we'll be talking a lot about in this course is the concept of a business cycle. So let's get into that to make sure we understand what the different sections are. So an economy will always go through these ebbs and flows as we work through time. You have expansions. Expansions are often called periods of economic growth. This is when the economy is growing, the economy is going well. But at some point we reach a peak where the economy cannot get any better. It's reached the peak, and now there's only one place to go, and that's down. After the peak, you have recessions or contractions. We sometimes will call this a contraction, where the economy is contracting, right? It's shrinking. Eventually, the economy cannot get any lower, and we reach a bottom called a trough. And at that point, we get back into another expansion, and then the business cycle starts up again. So keep that in mind. Whenever we say a period of economic growth or an expansion, basically the GDP is increasing period over period. The GDP is going up. The country is growing. It's like a company that's selling more and more and more. Peak. Then we get into a recession where the GDP is shrinking. Trough, bottom, we get back into another expansion. Great. So now we've talked about national income, GDP. National output, most of the time, and for our case, means the same thing. But now we're focused on the real GDP. What are we outputting as a country? What are we producing as a country? So the symbol for that is Y. We're going to use Y throughout this course. So you have national output, which is real GDP. Think of that as what we're actually making. Potential output, Y star. Think of this as the amount that we could produce if all of our resources, and remember, resources are land, labor, and capital, were fully employed. Now, what I mean by fully employed, I mean you don't have any waste or any inefficiencies, but you also don't have anybody working over capacity. If every employee was working the correct amount of time, if every machine was being used the correct amount of time. Again, nothing is being underused, but nothing is being overused. That is what we call fully employed or full employment. And whatever output you could produce at that amount or at full employment, we call the potential output. So it's not the same. It's what you think of it as what you should be making. What you're actually making, that's national output or real GDP. What you should be making is your real GDP, is your potential real GDP. Now, I think you see where I'm going with this. These two are not always the same. In fact, they're almost never the same. So let's talk about what it means when they're different. When there's a difference between the national output or the real GDP, the actual real GDP, and the potential GDP, you have what's called an output gap. And there are two kinds. Very important. Almost every chapter we'll talk about this. So it's important to lock this in from now. Whenever your real GDP, your actual real GDP, your actual production is greater than your potential, Think about what that means. You're producing more than you should be. We call that an inflationary gap. Why? Well, in order for you to produce more goods than you can, you need to overuse your resources. You need to make your workers work overtime. You need to use your machines more than they were made to be used. You need to really go hard on your land. So you're overusing your resources. And what happens when you overuse resources? Price goes up. And the easiest way to wrap your head around this, and the most important way, is wages. If you're asking all of your employees to work overtime and you need more and more workers, how do you do that? Well, eventually they're going to start asking you for a higher salary. Oh, you want me to come in and work 10 hours of overtime every week? Pay me more. Oh, you want to hire another 10 people very fast because you have a crazy demand for your products? Increase the salaries that you pay. So you see, when the economy is booming, wages start to go up. People start to demand higher pays. As wages start to go up, now the company has to start charging more to the customer to pay for those wages. So prices start to go up and you have inflation. And that's what inflation is. Inflation is just the steady rise of the price of all things. So whenever you're producing beyond your capacity, it creates inflation. We say it puts an upward pressure on price. Now, when the opposite is happening, when you're producing less than your potential, that means you're underusing. You don't have enough hours to give your workers. Your machines are sitting idle. The opposite effect happens. We have a downward pressure on price, and we typically will enter into a recession. So if I bring back the business cycle, let's connect those two. During expansions, we will often have inflationary gaps. And you can see here the blue line here represents your actual GDP, right? Remember, this is basically Y, and this is your potential, Y star. Whenever the actual is above, so whenever the actual is above the potential, we have inflationary gaps. And whenever the actual is less than your potential, we have recessionary gaps. It's not to say that whenever we have inflationary gaps, we're in an expansion, and whenever we have recessionary gaps, we're in a contraction. It's more to say that whenever the actual, you see here, like here, the actual GDP was above the potential. Whether, this line is going up and it's going down, so technically part of the contraction and part of the recession were in that inflationary gap. So that's not how I want you guys to think about it. Just think about it as inflationary gaps are when actual output exceeds potential, and recessionary gaps when actual output is less than potential. Awesome. Now, another thing that we're going to see throughout, mainly towards one of the later chapters, is the concept of employment. So here we're just going to do a quick introduction to it. So we often think of employed, unemployed as being a percentage of the population, but it's not. So let's break this down. When we talk about population in the context of labor being workers, we're only looking at people that are at least 15 years old, right? Anyone that is old enough to work. Within that, you have two categories: the labor force and those not in the labor force. The labor force is made up of anybody who has a job, we call them the employed, and those who do not have a job but are actively looking for one. And here's where students will often hit a wall. Unemployed doesn't mean you don't have a job. It means you want a job, but you don't have a job. I want a job, I would accept a job, but I can't find one, or I don't have one. I'm looking for one. So if you are looking for a job but you don't have one, you are part of the labor force, but you're unemployed. Anyone who is not working and is also not looking for work, a student going to school, somebody who's retired, somebody with a disability that doesn't allow them to work, they are not in the labor force at all. So the unemployment rate is really just a percentage of the labor force. You take the amount of people that are unemployed divided by the labor force, and that is your unemployment rate. So when you hear that the unemployment rate in Canada is, say, 7%, it doesn't mean 7% of all Canadians are unemployed. It means 7% of Canadians who want to work cannot find work. Now, there are different types of unemployment, different reasons, if you will. The first one, frictional unemployment, this is caused by irregular turnover of workers. Somebody who worked at a job, quit to go find a different job, was laid off, and is looking for a different job. So the period of time that they spend between jobs, they're unemployed. We call that frictional unemployment. Structural unemployment is a little bit different. This one is caused by a mismatch between the jobs available and the workers available. So for example, let's say a new factory for Tesla just opened up in Buffalo, New York. And there are 1,000 jobs available. But all of those jobs require vast knowledge of electric cars. And currently in that area, nobody really has any knowledge of electric cars. So you've got a ton of jobs available and you have workers available, but their skills don't match. So you have unemployment because of that structural mismatch between the jobs and the workers. Now, those two, you will learn, are always there. You're always going to have some frictional unemployment. You're always going to have some structural unemployment. These will never be zero. Cyclical unemployment, this has to do with the business cycle. If I go back to the business cycle, when the economy is expanding, you tend to have less unemployment because companies need workers, so they're hiring a bunch of workers. You have less unemployment. Unemployment goes down. And during recessions, you tend to have more unemployment. Again, companies are not doing so well. They have to lay people off. They're not hiring as much and so on. That's what you call cyclical unemployment. This one can be zero. So when can it be zero, or when is it zero? Whenever your potential output is equal, right there, to your potential. When your potential is equal to your actual, you have no cyclical unemployment. More on that once we get into the unemployment chapter. So this is what I was saying. While your cyclical unemployment may or may not be there, you will always have frictional and structural. So the term full employment means that there is only frictional and only frictional and structural unemployment. There is no cyclical unemployment. I know it sounds a little bit weird, right? But full employment means there is some unemployment, but it's only caused by frictional or structural reasons. Now, another important part of macroeconomics is the concept of productivity. So productivity is simply how much output can we get for one unit of input. For example, how many units can one worker make in a day? How many cars can one machine produce in a month? So it's output per unit of input. Formula is very simple. We often talk about labor productivity, so that formula is simple. Real GDP, which is, remember, real GDP is the total amount of goods that are produced, goods and services, divided by the units of work effort. Now, units of work effort could be number of hours of work, could be number of workers. The unit itself varies. So say, for instance, a country has a real GDP of 1 billion and it has 10 million workers. This works out to $100 per worker. So that is how productive our workers are. Every worker is producing $100 of GDP. And as this increases, our living standards tend to increase. The more productive we are as a population, the better life within our country is. Another thing we'll explore throughout the semester is the concept of inflation and price levels. Now, we already spoke a little bit about inflation a second ago when it came to the inflationary gap, but let's talk about it a little bit more here. A term you'll see a lot is called the price level. The price level is how we group all the prices of all things together. It's not the price of one particular thing. Because you can have a situation where most things in the economy have not gone up in price, but one thing has. And that's not really inflation. But when everything on average has gone up in price, you have inflation. So how do we measure that? We call that the price level. And the most common way to track it is called the Consumer Price Index, or the CPI. The CPI is really just a measure of the general price of things. Try and imagine a basket, and in that basket you have 10 things. Toothpaste, a loaf of bread, bus tickets, a liter of gas, shoes, whatever, right? And you take the price of all those things. And maybe the price of all those things in 2023 was $700. And then you check again in 2024, the same 10 things, $850. And then you check again in 2025, the same 10 things, $962. This price change is how we measure inflation. And that's essentially what the Consumer Price Index is. It's an index number used to measure the price level. How has the price of things changed over time? Now, as the price of things goes up, the purchasing power of your money goes down. When we say purchasing power, we really just mean, well, the power of a dollar. A dollar in 2023 was able to buy more than in 2024, and it was able to buy more than in 2025. You see, as the price of things goes up, so as the price level goes up, your dollar becomes weaker and weaker and weaker. We say it has less purchasing power. And that is what we call inflation. Now, there's two types of inflation, anticipated and unanticipated. Again, we're not going to go too deep into this right now, but just to scratch the surface, there's always going to be inflation. Right? In Canada, we try and keep inflation between 2 and 3%. So there's always a bit of inflation that is anticipated or expected by the economy. And that's fine. Anticipated inflation doesn't really cause a problem. Because if we're expecting it, the economy is working it in. Oh, if we're expecting inflation to be 2% next year, we're going to increase prices by 2%. We're going to increase wages by 2%. And then everything kind of stays even. It's when inflation is unanticipated that we have a problem. So if we were expecting inflation to be 2%, but it ended up being 8%, you have a massive problem. You have people that are getting underpaid. You have things that are becoming too expensive too quickly. The problem in an economy is whenever we have unanticipated inflation that we didn't account for and we didn't plan for. Now, related to inflation is the interest rate. And there are many, many, many different types of interest rates. Interest rates on loans, on credit cards, on the economy, and so on. But very often when we talk about interest rates, we're talking about the interest rate, right? The market interest rate in the economy. This is set by the government and is managed by the government. Now, in all cases, you have a nominal interest rate, which is, again, just the dollar amount. So let me explain. If you take out a $1,000 loan today, and then 1 year from now, you have to repay $1,100, you pay 10% interest. And that's what we call the nominal interest rate. It's the interest rate that just looks like the dollars of the principal and the dollars of the interest. But again, like with nominal GDP, it completely ignores inflation. Because during this time, if we had inflation of 3%, then you didn't really make 10%. Your purchasing power, although you have 10% more in dollars, your purchasing power is not 10% higher. Let's say inflation was 3%. Well, I would remove 3%, and in real terms, you made 7%. Your purchasing power increased by 7%. Now, that is if you're the one who's earning this money. There's many different ways to interpret it. If you're the one borrowing, we call this the true cost of borrowing. So maybe you're paying 10% in interest, but because of the inflation, it really, in real terms, again, only costs you 7%. Lastly, and something we'll explore really towards the end of this course, is the concept of exchange rates. Very quickly, exchange rates are really just the ratio of one currency to another. So I have Canadian dollars. I want to exchange them for US dollars. What is that exchange rate? 1 Canadian dollar can get me, 75 cents in the US, or $1 can get me $1.35 in Canada. It's the price of one currency in terms of another. There isn't really much to know here. One thing that's important is that for you to understand is that when an exchange rate goes up, it means that the domestic currency, so in this case the Canadian dollar, is depreciating. I'll give you an example. If the exchange rate for $1 is 1.35 Canadian, this means to buy $1 you need to spend $1.35 Canadian. And tomorrow this increases to $1.40. So the exchange rate is going up, right? It's the 135 and the 140. So whenever this exchange rate increases, it means that the US dollar or the foreign currency has become more expensive. So our currency, the Canadian dollar, has depreciated. We need to spend more Canadian dollars to buy that US dollar. Okay, so that's it for this introduction chapter. If you have any questions at all, please don't be shy. I'll see you at the next one.